Thank you, Administrator Wheeler. I join many in the science community who are deeply concerned about the EPA's proposed rule titled Strengthening Transparency in Regulatory Science. The proposed rule would impede, if not eradicate, the EPA's ability to fulfill its mission of protecting public health and the environment by limiting the scope of research that the EPA can consider in making decisions. As a cornerstone of its regulatory process, the EPA relies on peer-reviewed science, and the proposed rule perpetuates the incorrect notion that the science the EPA relies on is somehow hidden, and it's not. The information used by the EPA is not secret. I appreciate that your testimony acknowledged the need to issue a supplemental rule, but the proposed rule is an attack on the role of science itself at the EPA. So if finalized, it would have chilling consequences for the EPA and for people who benefit from clean air and clean water. So Administrator Wheeler, is the EPA's existing policy to consider scientific studies in the regulatory process, even if the underlying data is not publicly available in a manner sufficient for independent validation? That's just please yes or no. Existing policy.
With that data is not available to the public. I believe that the regulated public, the communities need to know what the science is based behind our decision.
But is the existing policy to consider studies even if the data is not publicly available? Is that the existing policy?
Yes, that is the existing policy.
And have the federal courts upheld the EPA's longtime policy regarding consideration of scientific data?
I don't believe that the courts have specifically addressed that specific issue.
Well,
We've received over 600,000 comments on our proposal. We've reviewed those comments over the last year, and that's why I believe we need to go forward with a supplemental proposal.
In footnote 3 of the proposed rule, it says that the courts have at times upheld EPA's use of non-public data in support of its regulatory actions. So footnote 3 also says that the proposed rule acknowledges that the EPA has not consistently observed the policies underlying the proposal. Isn't that correct? The EPA has not in the past.
Yes.
Thank you. So the proposed rule represents a reversal of the EPA's position for decades regarding the consideration of scientific data. If the proposed rule is asserting that the agency's previous position was incorrect, what evidence do you have to justify it?
Well, again, I cut my teeth on the Right to Know Act, and I believe that the American public has a right to know the science behind our regulatory decisions. And I think if we put that science out for everybody to see and understand, then there'll be more acceptance of our regulatory decisions. And that is what's driving me on this question, is I believe that we should be transparent in everything that we do.
Mr. Administrator, the basis of the proposed rule, I agree with the scientific community, is flawed. So before finalizing the rule of such significance, I urge the EPA to listen to scientific experts. So yes or no, will the supplemental rule mentioned in your testimony be published prior to 2020?
I was hoping it would be published prior to 2020, but in my staff notes, I'm told early next year. Things seem to take a little bit longer than I like, but we'll certainly publish the supplemental
I want to get a couple more questions
for public comment before we finalize it.
Yes or no, will you commit to waiting for the conclusion of the Science Advisory Board's comprehensive review before you finalize the final rule?
We certainly hope to have that. I specifically
yes
asked
or no?
the science. Yes, I specifically asked the Science Advisory Board to look at the proposal.
And will you commit to working with the National Academy of Sciences on the development of the proposed rule?
I don't believe we've reached out to the National Academy of Sciences at this point.
I hope that you will. And
again, the science community is not unanimous on this. You said the science community is opposed to this. We had over 600,000 comments. A lot of scientists
I understand, and I want to get just
support
another quick question. The proposed rule is inconsistent with the agency's statutory obligation to use the best available science as required in many statutes under your jurisdiction. Would the proposed rule retroactively apply to the EPA's existing standards and regulations?
Our proposal did not retroactively apply, and there was still an exemption so that the administrator could allow a study that was important to move forward, even if that science wasn't available to the public, if we needed to use that study for regulatory purposes.
Thank you. My time has expired. I will be submitting more questions for the record. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.